All right, welcome everyone to the September Focus series. Today we're focusing on enabling conversations on legacy. And I must say, this is one of my favorite conversations and topics because I think it's so unique to every individual when you ask them, what does legacy mean for you? It's always a very unique and personal and meaningful conversation to have with clients. So, I mean, I think when you send out that discovery link and the client clicks on legacy is important right at the end, it's always exciting because just by asking them, you mentioned legacy is important to you. Tell me, what does legacy mean for you? And you get such an insight into who's important to the client, what's important to them, what legacy means for them. So I think it's a really, really great conversation to have with every client around legacy and what it means for them. And just in having those conversations or hearing about them over the years, seeing the different things that legacy means for clients. For some, it's about, I want to give my kids an education where they don't have to worry about student loans, or it could be, I want to give them a different start in life to what I had, or it could be an organization or a charity that the client really connects to, and that's part of their legacy, or generational legacy. We have this tradition of passing this on from generation to generation. But the key thing is it's always unique and it really gives you an insight into what's important to that client. But when we think about legacy from a financial planning point of view, as Benny mentioned, it's a massive topic. There's so many components that fall into this legacy conversation, whether it's things like the will and if that's in place, or beneficiaries or wishes of the client, or providing clarity for the family, understanding the costs that are associated and how we're going to fund that, to, what generational transfer looks like for that client. So what we did for today is we came up with a framework. And the idea behind this framework is to think, could we have a framework in place that helps us as planners work through and navigate all the different conversations that are encompassed in legacy planning? But could it also be a framework that helps us, position that with clients, that there's lots of steps in this process and lots of different conversations that we need to have and make sure that these things are in place. So please, if you're looking at this framework and you think, oh, there's something missing, or I'd add this, let's co-create it together. Please share with us what your thoughts on this would be. And is it helpful? Is it helpful to navigate through those different conversations, but also helpful in positioning with clients that there are lots of different conversations we need to have, and potentially an order in which we need to have them. So I'm just going to step through the idea behind, this legacy hierarchy or framework that we can use in enabling this conversation. And if we start right at the bottom of the first part of this pyramid, it's about that living legacy. So understanding that part of legacy planning is ensuring that the client can sustain their lifestyle. So if you think of clients that are retiring, that they can sustain the income that they need, that they can achieve the dreams that they have or the goals that they have in retirement up, until death. And part of that legacy could be, not being dependent on children. So how do we sustain that income and ensure that they've got that living legacy? Once we've got that in place, we can move to that next step in the pyramid, which we're calling sort of seamless transition. But the idea behind this is that, in the event of a death, how do we ensure that, at least from a financial point of view, that we can create a very seamless transition? And this is obviously conversations around, is the will in place and up to date? Can we, what sort of costs will there be? Can we ensure that the client can cover those costs and meet that obligation? But most importantly, ensure that there's clarity, that everyone has a good understanding of what that transition will look like, and make it as seamless for the client as we can. Once you go, to that next layer, then it's about thinking about sustaining the dependence. So once we've got, we've sustained the lifestyle, we know what that transition is going to look like, then it's about having conversations around, if one spouse passes away, can we sustain the lifestyle for the other spouse or other dependents within the family, and ensure that they can, support the income and requirements that they have for life. Then we start talking about, bespoke bequests or, specific bequests. I want to give this to this individual, or I want to leave this to that individual or organization or charity. What are those specific bequests or beneficiaries? And then right at the top of the pyramid is that then generational transition. Do I want to grow and sustain generational wealth? And how do we transfer that? And here we're talking about, structures and trusts, etc., and putting that in place. But thinking behind this framework is that it can help us work through this with a client. So I know in my own personal experience, and perhaps you've experienced this with clients as well that are approaching retirement, and you're working through the options with them. And I've seen this, with family, friends, they immediately start thinking about, but I want to leave this to my kids. Again, they jump straight up to that bespoke bequest part of the pyramid, because they've worked for that and they want to ensure that that goes to their children. But perhaps having a framework like this can help us to say, we'll get there, but we want to start here. We first want to secure your lifestyle, ensure that you can achieve your goals and dreams, not be dependent if that's important. Then we want to look at, is there a seamless transition? Do we have everything in place in terms of the will, beneficiaries, costs, and make sure that there's clarity? Then we want to ensure that we can sustain the income needs for the dependents, your spouse or other dependents that you may have, and then start working through those bespoke bequests, beneficiaries, and that generational transfer. So hopefully this framework helps just, bring that all together, all those different conversations, helps us position that with clients, that there is potentially an order, and it might be different from client to clients, might even be circular, as things change further up, it might mean we need to start again at the bottom and secure all of that again. But I think it helps us to say this is a involved conversation. There's lots of different aspects. Let's make sure we're working through all of that with the clients and understanding what is important to them and that we're achieving these steps along the way. Right. So what I'm going to do now is just go through an example in Asset Map, and I want to talk through, some of the features that can help us enable these conversations. Now, as we said, that there's a lot of conversations. We're not going to cover all of them today, but I want to cover the ones, the features that can really help us, especially in those bottom layers of this pyramid. So I'm going to just stop sharing and share Asset Map now, and then we can work through an example together. Yeah. Okay, perfect. You should be seeing the asset map screen now. Coming up, there we go. All right. So here we have a new example client today. We've got Matthew and Jessica, and they're still quite young. Matthew's 40, Jessica's 38. Matthew's mom is also dependent, so we've got Sheila at the top there. And because they're younger, we've got a retirement plan in place, and they're working towards that. But for a client like this, when we're talking about legacy, we're thinking more around, if there's an unexpected death, how do we then move through those different tiers and ensure we've enabled all of those conversations? So if we have a look at Matthew and Jessica, we can see that they're both earning an income. They've each got their retirement funds that they're contributing towards. Matthew's also got a share portfolio. He's also got a business on the side, so sports business. And on Jessica's side, she's got a unit trust as well. Got some life cover, a bit of income protection, and a property with a mortgage. But if we think of that first layer on the pyramid, in the event of an unexpected death, one of the things we want to look at is the will in place? What are the costs going to be? Are the beneficiaries in place? And the features in Asset Map that can help us really enable those conversations is firstly the addition of legal at the top here. So right here, I can note any specifics, important details about the will so that I can ensure it is in place. If not, we can, work on putting that in place for the client. But I can note here that there is a will. I can also now select that it can be nominated as a beneficiary, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I can note who the applicable members are, where it's stored. So that's quite important. It's in the home office, so we all know where that is. And I can put in any additional notes. So looking through the will here, they've specified that share portfolio is sort of earmarked for Matthew's mom in the event of an unexpected death, that'll be used to support and provide an income for her. Otherwise, everything else goes to each other. So important things that we can note here is things like residue or anything else in the will we can add in the note section. Another great use while we're in legal is I often get asked, how do I note how clients are married? If they're married ANC or with accrual or COP, using legal to note that is a great way of just capturing the details of that. I can put in the marital contracts. I can, put in more details around if it's community of property, if it's ANC with or without accrual. And I can also note any specifics, assets excluded from the marriage or accrual details, commencement values, anything else that I want to note about that marital contract, I can add into legal here. So have a look out for that. All right, so if we think that's in place, the will's in place, we have an understanding, the next step is to think about, what are the beneficiaries? Now we know that on every asset, income, insurance, you can add in who is the beneficiary. So if I go ahead and click on the retirement funds, you can see that I've added in who the primary beneficiary is of that specific investment. I can also put in contingent beneficiaries, which means if something happens to the primary beneficiary, who does it go to in that event? So I can add that as the contingent beneficiaries as well. And now because I can select the will or even add estates as an individual as part of the household, I can also select that as a beneficiary. So I'm just going to go over here to relationships and just talk a little bit about how we can add relationships at the top. And those are the relationships that reflect on the asset map, excuse me, for the household. But I can also see here under entities the will, and I could add other relationships like estate, for example, where I can allocate them as beneficiaries. So we know, for example, that unit trust investment will go into the estate in the event of death. Then I can actually go ahead and select estate as the primary beneficiary. Same with the share portfolio, I can select that is going to the mom in terms of the will. We've already established that in the contracts. And then I can view the beneficiaries on the beneficiary page. You'll see now it's nice and visual as well. So I can open this up, have that conversation with the client, clarify, are these the beneficiaries? Is this correct? So we can see here for Matthew, everything goes to Jessica except for that share portfolio that's going to his mom in the event of death. And if I pop over to Jessica, here I can see what's going into the estate. So I can see that unit trust there and that all other assets are going to Matthew. So if we think about that first tier of that pyramid, we can use legal to really understand what are the contracts in place, is the will in place, what is the marital contracts. We can add beneficiaries, view the beneficiaries to ensure we are reflecting what the client's wishes are in terms of beneficiaries. But the next step in that layer is understanding what are the costs on death and how do we ensure that there's enough liquidity to cover those costs on death. And for that, we're obviously going to go into target maps. Now, for the purpose of this presentation, I've split it into different target maps. You could do it in one, you could do it separately. It really depends on the conversation you're wanting to have with the client. If I specifically want to talk through, a liquidity on death conversation and unpack what are the costs going to be at death, then I can split that out as its own specific target map. So here you'll see I've done one for Matthew and I've done one for Jessica. And how I created that is under new target maps by selecting custom. Okay, so I've created a custom target map. And if I open that up for Matthew, you'll see that under the what you want section, I've added specific line items, one to cover debt, because that's going to be, one of the expenses or costs that we want to cover in the event of death. But I've also added a line item to show that there could potentially be other costs, estate duty, executors fees, capital gains tax, all of which we want to make sure we can cover in the event of death. Now, the next question would be, well, how do I know what those costs are going to be? Now, I know all of you have different ways in which you calculate what those costs on death might be. You may have your own specific calculators that you use or a process or fiduciary specialists that you use for that. Whichever way you use it, I'm going to talk through one way you can use it as well. But whichever way you're doing that, adding it into the target map really helps facilitate that conversation. It makes it really tangible. These are what the costs are going to be. And then I can open up a conversation around, but how are we going to fund those costs? How are we going to meet those costs in the event of death? But for those of you who would like to, we do have calculators that we've put together on the Work That Matters website. So it's available to anyone. You can go onto the workthatmatters.co.za website, and you'll see under calculators at the top that we've got estate planning calculators for ANC, COP, and single. If you've used it before, you'll notice that there's now new ones. So we are launching today new calculators. We've taken your feedback around making the inputs a bit easier, enhancing the reporting that comes out of that. So please go ahead and use the new ones. If you haven't used them before, just start straight with the new ones. But these are standalone calculators that help us when needed to go in and see what will those costs be on death, and then we can bring the output of that into the target map to facilitate the actual meaningful conversation part, which is, all right, now if we know this is what the costs are going to be, how are we going to fund that? So just to give you an idea of how these calculators work, you can now put in, the plan of details, so your details right at the top. And then you can put in additional client information, like clients' names, as well as particulars from the will. Is the residue going to spouse? If it's accrual, is it with or without? That you can put in under additional information. And then you fill in the data here for the clients. You'll see this input is really simple and quick and easy to do. So here for this particular client, we know they're married, community of property. I've put in their primary residence and the base cost that's on that. And then I can indicate, who it's going to in the event of death, either the spouse, someone else, or the estate, or perhaps, it's split between that. And you can put in those percentages. I've put in the small business here. That is going to the spouse and it will be sold on death. And I've added in the unit trust and the shares going to someone else, which is in this case Matthew's mother. And then at the bottom here, I've added in the policies. That's the only information you need to fill in, and you'll immediately see below that it calculates the result. So what that shows us here is in the event of the client's death, what will the estate duty, executors fees, capital gains tax, and total cost be, as well as in the event of the spouse's death, or in the event of simultaneous death or joint death, what will the cost be then? So it immediately gives you those results. And so, below that, you can go and have a look at the detailed calculations. How is it calculating? What's been incorporated into each of those calcs? So you can go here and have a look at that detail. And then right at the bottom, you can put in any notes, any assumptions that you've made, and send that report to yourself. On this screen as well, while you're doing the inputs, you can always open up here and see the outcome of those inputs immediately on the side. So you can see if I change something, how it's going to impact the estate duty, the executor's fees, and the CGT. Once you've generated the report, just want to give you a quick view. It'll email a PDF report to you. It's got a cover page showing, it is in community of property, your information on there, shows all the inputs, immediately shows you the results so you can see what those costs are, and it gives you the breakdown of each of the calculations of how we got to those costs. Okay, so that's all included here in that report. And then what the key part here is that I want to go and understand what those costs are going to be. In this case, it's this amount, and then I can go ahead and copy that into my target map to show that in this case, there's not going to be estate duty or capital gains tax, but there is going to be there is going to be executors fees. So I can put that amount in and update. Now I can start to have that conversation with the client. I've always got that report as a backing of how we got to those calcs, but here's where the power comes in and saying to the client, this is what the costs are going to be. We're going to need 1.2 million in order to cover the executors fees as well as the liability in the event of death. Now I can start talking through, well, what are we going to use to fund those costs? And in this case, we know that there's a unit trust investment, so we could put that in, but while it helps, it's not quite going to cover all of the costs. We know the share portfolio is ideally for his mom in the event of death. So now we can open up a conversation around either we need to make changes or we need to think about how we're going to facilitate these costs in the event of death. And I can create these cost of death target maps for, Matthew in the event of Jessica's death, in the event of simultaneous death. In this case, I know there's enough life cover to cover that, but it opening up that conversation around what is that going to look like? How do we, ensure that we can meet it? And what are the changes that we may need to make in order to facilitate that? And all of that is just that first layer on the pyramid, that creating that seamless transition, understanding the wall, understanding the beneficiaries. What are the costs going to be? How are we funding that? Now we move to that next layer, which is saying, okay, in the event of death, we also want to ensure that we can maintain the lifestyle of the surviving spouse or any other dependents. And there again, I'm going to use target maps. So here I can show, the income replacement. In this case, they've said, he would need 300,000 per annum to replace income in the event of Jessica's death, and that he would need that for 20 years, keeping up with inflation. We know that Jessica has life cover of 6 million, so we've included that, and we can see that that is enough to fund the income that he would need in the event of her death with some surplus. So that immediately gives us that ability to have a sort of trade-off conversation of whether some of the life cover goes into the estate to cover costs or how we want to approach that. So you can see how we can use target maps to facilitate both of those conversations, either in one or keep it separate, depending on the conversation we want to have with the clients. Okay. Then we can start thinking about bespoke beneficiary requests and how that impacts the picture. Or, that top of the pyramid where we start talking about generational transfer from one generation to another. And that's where we can start using things like trust and also relationship maps to show what that structure and transfer will look like. All right. So I'm going to pop back over into the presentation and this off. Okay. So if we just recap on this, started off by saying, when clients are approaching retirement, we want to ensure that they can sustain that lifestyle. We want to run those retirement target maps, see what sort of income they need. How are we funding that? Are we achieving all of their dreams? Then we can start looking at that seamless transition, using legal to update the will, using the beneficiaries to see, are we reflecting the beneficiaries in the way that the client wants? Is that, and what impact does that have from a cost point of view? Can we meet those costs? Is there enough liquidity in the event of death? Can we ensure that clarity? Then we can use target maps to show, can we sustain the lifestyle of the dependents in the event of a death? And then start looking at what bespoke requests, how do we show that in relationship maps or in beneficiaries? And then lastly, that future transfer of generational wealth, and can we use relationship maps to enhance and enable that conversation? All right. And then just before we end off, I want to give everyone a sneak peek. As you know, in Asset Map, all the development that we're doing is aimed around enabling more conversations. And we're super excited about the next enhancements, which is priorities. This will be launching in the next couple of weeks. And the idea behind this is to enable and facilitate a conversation where we can explore with the client what their priorities are. So working through the list and adapting it to understand what priorities the client has, and then understand the urgency and importance of those priorities so that we can, map it against that and then start running, target maps where need be. But the key thing here is priorities will help us open up that discussion with clients around what is important to them, what are the things that they want to achieve, what are their priorities, and what is the urgency and importance that we want to associate with each one of those. So we're super excited for that. Watch out for that in the next couple of weeks. And the October focus series will focus on priorities.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Kirsty. Just two immediate thoughts from my side. Really well done. Congratulations to Kirsty on those estate planning calculators. She's probably spent the best part of a year on that upgrade. And the guiding principle, which Kirsty always reminds me of, is we've got to make it very technical. In other words, the calculations, there's a lot of complexity inside the calculations, but from an ease of use perspective, it must be really, you could literally do it in 5 minutes. So I think the tools really strikes that balance between being like really thinking about every single complexity, but making it as simple as possible to capture. That's the one thing. And the second thing is, yeah, I'm excited about this priorities because it fits into so many parts of the planning process, whether it's upfront, engaging a client or re-engaging a client, right through to reviews, to sort of, and one of the words we use here is to celebrate. Also to look back at priorities and celebrate successes and stuff. So yeah, so I think priorities is going to really be able to make it your own into so many different types of client engagements. Yeah. So just again, well done, Kirsty, on
Thanks.
the calculators.
Big
Some
team
good,
effort, so thank
there were
you.
some good comments as well from the audience. Some of them directly to the panelists saying, can we please help with training and stuff? Yeah. So we'll reach
Yes.
out to everyone uh, about the calculators.
Yeah. Brilliant. And
Oh,
please, yeah, try it out and let us know your thoughts and give us your feedback on that as well as on this framework we introduced today. We'd love to hear, if you think that fits in, what you'd add to it, make it your own. Yeah, and again, a very powerful conversation asking a client, what does legacy mean to you?